The will to DIY is one man's Sisyphean task to ask questions of why.
Hey, welcome back. All right, what I want to do today is stitch together a couple of ideas from multiple sources, trying to sort of get a handle on the current madness of the world and how we got here. Part 1. So when considering madness, the internet and social media seem to be the key points people like to discuss. One idea that's sort of floated out in a couple of economist blogs, such as Marginal Revolution, is the idea that the internet is a relatively new technology that we have not caught up to evolutionarily as a species. There's a British anthropologist named Robin Dunbar, and he posited that in roughly 1990 that tribes and farms and even Roman military units tend to have about 150 people in them. So apparently our neocortex is hardwired to accommodate between 100 and 250 stable interpersonal relationships. Well, what happens is eventually you don't recognize everyone, you start feeling uneasy with strangers, tribal leader becomes 2 or 3 shamans, 2 or 3 priests, and they each have their own way of thinking that something is right and the other person's wrong, and this helps to really split a tribe anyway. In Sapiens, Yuval Noah Harari says we develop a society with larger than tribal group size, let's call this a super Dunbar size, right, through shared ideology, through stories and grand narratives that can allow people to accommodate, tolerate, or even revel in this kind of discomfort of being amongst strangers. So then you kind of get to add in the invention of money, economies of scale through specialization. Also, we're assuming that we share a common goal. And this could be a god, king, country, what it means to be a good person, a good citizen. And typically, though, there's some sort of xenophobic thing that's still this impulse that's left over from our tribes of fighting off the other or the stranger. And this can also be harnessed by the narrative for both political and economic ends. At some point, we, the proles, the unwashed masses, of course, we're swallowing the story that's handed to us, right? And it maybe is making our life better, maybe making it worse. But we sort of allow and welcome the leadership of a super elite who would focus on and specialize in running the country and handling the politics. So, for instance, if I'm a wheel maker, my life is better spent making wheels, and I'll let you negotiate the deal to trade for sheep. Well, then comes the internet, much, much later, of course, which is all fine and dandy, right? As social media is super dandy, until all of a sudden everything is toxic and we're radicalizing people who were previously never political, but now they're all distraught and opinionated about everything all the time. As a species, we still have a Dunbar limit and a limited scope of our world that's built into us. Yet with access to not just 150 people, but thousands and tens of thousands and millions of people with ideas and pithy arguments, we have gone from operating on a very local level, like a clique, to laying claim to this kind of realm of the super elite of politics. We now apparently know how to govern and what's best for a country. I mean, of course, when we're not busy making wheels. So where did we get our training for this? Well, television, news, Facebook, and probably some of our radicalized friends. More to the point, though, is in this new super Dunbar world, we must have narratives for people to coexist as a society. Yet what are the stories and where are we getting them from? Through social media and TV, of course, but those seem to be generating polarizing in-group stories that are actively working to dismantle social cohesion, not to create it. In the 1940s, the U.S. introduced the FCC Fairness Doctrine, and this demanded that news be, quote, honest, equitable, and balanced, which of course now sounds like Fox News doublespeak. And this was probably because we learned how toxic one-sided conversations could be after World War II, fascism. In 1987, we removed the Fairness Doctrine. So now when you watch, quote, news, it's actually just opinion. Or it's just another polarizing narrative. It's just more outrage entertainment, right? In short, we learned a lesson, a very hard lesson, and then we promptly forgot it and we worked very hard to dismantle it. To tie this up into a nice little package, there's humanism, or individualism, and capitalism, which is really just kind of growth at any cost, which are the default norms of truth of our society. And we have, through post-structuralism and deconstructionism, been able to dismantle every grand narrative of social cohesion into these sort of petty, bigoted actors who are pursuing their own twisted desires and hurting people along the way. And what we're left with is a vacuum of meaning. There's this kind of space where the old stories of how we will proceed, the goals that we're going to achieve, this is left vacant. And we know that nature abhors a vacuum, so it must be filled by new voices. And these tend to be sourced from the collective consciousness, which tends to lean toward the loudest voices on social media. So new goals are generated from the extremes of the internet, and these require new allegiances, which of course can shift stances overnight. The prevailing alliances on the right and left both seem to be demanding dissent and outrage. They're demanding absolutes. This is really Sith Lord language from the dark side, right? You're either with us or against us. And we're watching your social media page for proof, right? This need for constant social signaling, this self-labeling, and this reductive trend to team politics, these are all signs of groupthink, and they're in direct contradiction of claims for individual freedom. Part 2. Another idea I'd like to overlay onto the previous set of ideas pulls from a line in the book Shop Class is Soulcraft by Matthew Crawford. This is kind of one of my new favorite books, and I'm only halfway through it. But the insight today is when this shop teacher is discussing craftsmanship to his students. He talks about the process being one of making constant iterative corrections, so that we make finer and finer oscillations as we work towards an ideal, towards perfection. So our awareness of the world, of the conditions in which we work and the materials we use all these things and we refine our techniques with knowledge gained over time. And maybe we never reach perfection, but we're constantly making small corrections towards it. So I kind of envision this process as a spiral moving ever inward, ever more precise, taking into account more and more variables, starting wide, but tightening up as we proceed, as we get closer to our goal. So there's this kind of objective ideal that can be met, especially doing craftsmanship stuff. It can basically be judged, engaged. I mean, you can't bullshit your way out of a bad joint or an incorrect dimension, right? If a door doesn't close, you obviously did it wrong. There's really no one here to blame but yourself, so you just get after it and you do it again, and hopefully you get better at it. This is the part that I find really baffling, is I sort of delight in the painfully odd failures that by taking on some sort of challenge and becoming better at something very small in a very small way, it's kind of like I can get this more perfect result that can be judged objectively. And whenever I do something well in that sense, I get this kind of profound existential victory. It's a constructive act that really places me in a happy relationship to the world. What's strange about it is that I think it risks much less and it returns much more to me than some other behaviors. So for instance, when I deconstruct the world and I can publish it for external consumption, there's really not an ideal that I'm trying to achieve at the center, but really there's a problem. And then the work tends to go backwards, where I spiral outward with my oscillations, dismantling external interlocking oppressions, and this attempt to free myself and others from confusion and pain. But no matter how many of these things I interrogate as I move outwards, the pain is still there, even if I do understand it better. So I continue outward until I've basically deconstructed or excoriated the entire world, and yet there's always more trauma to mine and there's more blame to assign. In Madness of Crowds, Douglas Murray brings up numerous problems with our behavior, our tendency to sort of align with social pressures, even despite their glaring contradictions that point to their own illogic and disaster. He points out two things that really struck me about social media and the internet in general. I think we all logically know that there's social mores, and these are sort of shifting lines. What's appropriate now wasn't appropriate in the 90s, right? But the internet's memory is very deep, and any previous missteps can be pulled forward into the present to burn somebody. And one thing Murray brings up is he doesn't find any place on the internet for forgiveness. And this is exact opposite of personal relationships, right? You can always forgive people in person, but the internet doesn't allow for this. Murray basically says that the point of how current social media pressures tend to work, the goal isn't to generate kinder, wiser individuals, but to perpetuate doubt, wherein you question yourself and sources of authority until nothing is true, except for the fickle logic of the crowd. And even if you pause and say, wait a second, can we talk about this? Well, this becomes tantamount to party treason. It's asking to be trampled. It's risking being ostracized or canceled. And the only safe place is within the herd, but of course, it might change direction at any moment without you knowing. In the book On Tyranny, Timothy Snyder says, "Believe in truth. To abandon facts is to abandon freedom." Unfortunately, whenever you're doing the crowd thing, you can start to doubt what the truth may be. Truth or facts, right? Both of these terms have devolved into dismissible phrases. They're really of no use in the current climate where we believe only what the party demands and we can always dismiss anything else. We've basically deconstructed them exactly so we can be free. We're free from the return to logic or rationality that they might impose on people. That's what's weird about this foray into attempting a craft. To return to the real world where it's harder to hand cut a joint than to issue a scathing diatribe, where constraints are not dismissible, where nothing is cancelable or malleable, but everything must be addressed and navigated according to their own nature, according to their character. Okay, thanks for your time today. So this podcast jumped off a bit from our philosophical cliff notes into some more homegrown stitching together of ideas from at least 4 or 5 sources. This kind of thing stems from books I'm reading, podcasts I'm listening to, and whatever else, but it tends to introduce a lot of contradictions that I haven't sorted out yet, but this does become a place to jot them down. Of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the parallels I'm attempting to conflate here, where physical engagement trains us to be better thinkers, better people, maybe even better citizens.